Hello, everyone. It's Chris Hobart, the Wealthologist, and today we're going to peel back the curtain on one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the Federal Reserve. No doubt you've seen the headlines about interest rates. Jacob and I have talked about interest rates a ton, which leads to inflation, as well as Jerome Powell's press conferences. But here's the thing. There's a lot that the Fed's not saying, and I think it's time that we start asking the tough questions. So are you ready to dive in? All right, let's go. All right, let's start with the basics. Jerome Powell's press conferences. These events, it's where a select group of reporters get to ask Powell questions about the economy. But instead of digging deep, most of the questions are variations of the same exact thing every single time. You know the question, when are you cutting the interest rates? That's important, no doubt, because there's impacts and it can shift markets and all that good stuff and impacts housing loans and all of that. But I got to tell you, there's other questions, big questions, that nobody seems to ask. Like one that I would love to ask if I were there in the press conference, whatever happened to super core inflation? Now, I know what you're thinking. You either had the same question yourself, or you might be thinking, what on earth is super core inflation, Chris? You're not alone if that's the case. So super core is a measure that excludes stuff like food and energy and even housing rents to focus on services tied to wages. So a couple of years ago, the Fed was all about it. Now, why? Well, really? Because it painted a less alarming picture of inflation during the pandemic. But let's fast forward to now. And guess what? Super core inflation is up over 4% and running hotter than it was last year. Now, the Fed, they don't talk about it anymore. Now, why is that? Did it suddenly turn to be, it wasn't that important, it wasn't a good measure? Or is the truth inconvenient because super core shows inflation is still way above the 2% target that they're aiming for? Next up, I want to talk with you about the money supply, specifically M2. And we've touched on this before, and so I don't want you to tune out, but this one's fascinating. You see, during the first 2 years of COVID, the Fed pumped the money supply up by over 40%. Well, what happened next? The worst inflation in 40 years. Now, do we think that's a coincidence? I don't think so. Then the Fed started pulling back and inflation cooled. So here's my question. Why doesn't the Fed talk about M2 anymore? If it did such a great job predicting inflation, why isn't it front and center in their strategy now? Is there a better metric? And if so, why weren't they using it before inflation ran wild? I kind of feel like it's watching someone repeatedly set off a fire alarm and just act surprised when it goes off. Now, here's the kicker. The Fed's spending habits. Did you know the Federal Reserve has been losing around $100 billion a year for the past 2 years? Now, to be clear, that's losses that taxpayers, you and me, are covering through the Treasury. Yet the Fed is still funding research on things like childcare and lead water pipes. No doubt, important topics, right? But are they really the Fed's jobs? We've already got entire agencies dedicated to these issues. Meanwhile, the Fed's actual responsibilities like managing monetary policy and regulating banks, well, that seems to be more than enough to handle, right? So I guess here's the real question. Who decides what the Fed spends money on? Is there an oversight? Are there any dollar limits? Or does the Fed just get to decide what's important regardless of cost? You see, the Fed's balance sheet has ballooned by 700% since 2008. Now, you heard me right. That's 700%. Where is the accountability for how that money gets spent? So here's the bottom line. The Federal Reserve has a lot of explaining to do. From ignoring inconvenient inflation data to dodging questions about its spending habits, it's clear that more transparency is needed. So my question to you, what do you think? Should the press be pushing harder for answers, or is the Fed just doing a fine job on its own? do me a favor. Let me know in the comment section below, and I'd love your feedback. And also, if you enjoyed the video, if you liked the content, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're here every week breaking down the money matters that matter most to you. Also, always feel free to share this with friends, family. We have some folks that asked if they could share it with students. Absolutely. Whoever this content's good for, if it's good for you or anybody else, please feel free to share it. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.